Well, thank you everyone for being here for this, one of the opening panels of this wonderful conference. My name is Evelyn Bailey, and I'm a doctoral candidate in political science here at Notre Dame. And I was limping over here because I was running yesterday, so I think my tardiness fits with the theme of the panel. So the panel theme is Verso, Sport, the Body, and Human Flourishing. Our first panelist, I'll introduce all of the panelists, and then we'll have the first one come up and give his presentation. So our first panelist is Kevin Stewart from the University of St. Thomas, Houston. Dr. Kevin E. Stewart is an assistant professor in political science, director of the Nesty Center for Faith and Culture, and director of the Masters in Public Policy and Administration program at the University of St. Thomas, Houston. Previously, he served as president of the Austin Institute for the Study of Family and Culture, a social science research institute in Austin, Texas, that has an excellent podcast, I might add, that you might all look up. He received his PhD from the University of Texas at Austin, where he studied public law and political philosophy, and was a visiting scholar at the University of Cambridge. He earned a Master of Sciences from the London School of Economics and Political Science after receiving undergraduate degrees in history and English literature from Louisiana State University. He is chairman of the board for the Catholic Education Growth Fund, past chairman of the Diocesan School Advisory Board for the Diocese of Austin, editor of the Catholicism and Society book series for the Society for Catholic Social Scientists from Franciscan University Press, a former headmaster at St. Mary's Catholic High School in Taylor, Texas, and the owner of an award-winning strategy consulting and media firm. So quite the Renaissance man we have here. He and his wife have 3 boys under the age of 10, so all of their work papers have crayon on them. So that will be our first presentation, who will be talking about acedia and human flourishing. Our second panelist will be Margaret Berry from the University of Notre Dame. Her panel presentation will be Carving a Path to Rome, the Catholic Conversion of Ski Pioneer Sir Arnold Lunn from 1888 to 1974. There's his dates. Margaret is a doctoral candidate in the Department of History here at Notre Dame, and her dissertation explores the religious conversions of English skier Sir Arnold Lunn and American skier Dolores La Chapelle to illustrate the relationship between mountains and Catholicism, Verso Alto, you could say, in the 20th century North Atlantic world. Before pursuing her doctoral studies, Margaret worked as a high school teacher and field instructor in Montana, Massachusetts, and Wyoming. So we also have a Renaissance woman on the panel. She also holds a BA from Williams College and an MA in teaching from Montana State University. Margaret's interest in the mountains was personal long before it was academic. She recently moved back to her markedly flat hometown of Columbus, Ohio, with her husband Jackson, a fellow domer, but is an avid trail runner, backcountry skier, and hiker. And then our final presentation today will be from Margaret Schuleter, who's also here at Notre Dame, and is called Finding the Cross in an Easy World, Distance Running as a Modern Education in Traditional Practices of Discipleship. So Margaret Schuleter is in her final year of Notre Dame's Master of Divinity program. She previously completed her BA in Philosophy and Religion at Hillsdale College, where she also competed in the cross-country and track and field teams, earning multiple national honors. As a student, she currently serves in Notre Dame's campus ministry with pastoral care. She grew up in rural Michigan, but resides now in South Bend with her husband Leo and their 1-year-old daughter Matilda. She is passionate about teaching the Catholic faith outside of the classroom setting, for example, through mentor relationships, athletics, and ecumenical relationships. So, very excited to hear what our panelists have to say. Please, Dr. Stewart.
Thank you. As proof that I was honest in my bio, I got on the plane this morning to look over my notes from Jean-Charles Nault's The Noonday Devil, and this is what the first couple of pages look like. So apparently, the 5-year-old has been reading about acedia. In that great classic film of the 1980s, one of the heights of 20th century cinema, Ferris Bueller's Day Off, at one point Ferris says to Cameron, "You're not dying. You just can't think of anything good to do." And it's a classic line that, like all great comedy, is funny in part because it captures an insight. I should start this. Here we go. The insight is just how fundamental to human life the orientation of action toward the good is, right? That we need something good to do. I hope to shed a little light today in just these few minutes on one dimension of that. This project, so the title, as you can see, is acedia. Okay, this word is troublesome because there are about 14 different ways that people pronounce it, and I think the key is to just pick one and stay with it. So I'm going to go with acedia, which seems to be the modal response, but if you say achadia, I'll know what you're talking about, so it'll be fine. This project began as a meditation on Jonathan Haidt's Anxious Generation, if you know or are familiar with that book. In it, he charts the rise in anxiety, depression, major depression, suicide, various other psychological disorders. Pair that with Nobel laureates Deaton and Case, who wrote Deaths of Despair, which considers several kinds of deaths, so alcohol, cirrhotic livers, drug overdoses, and suicides as sort of one form of death, one factor, and then looks at how that tracks and what that does to the data to consider it that way. And then to add another recent publication, in 2023, the Surgeon General of the United States issued a report on an epidemic, not of a disease, but of loneliness. So it has now risen to the level of being a national public health concern. Haidt's insight in Anxious Generation is that at the bottom of all of these psychological problems, they are not at root psychological problems. They are at root spiritual problems. Now, this is a particularly remarkable insight coming from him, one, because he's a psychologist. So this is what lawyers would call an admission against interest, right? The second is he is not a man of faith himself. He says, he confesses that we seem to have, as human beings, a God-sized hole, a God-shaped hole in our hearts. But he is not himself a man of faith. So this is a remarkable interlocutor. I have tremendous respect for him with which to engage, because there are a couple of admissions against interest right off the bat, but he thinks they're true. At exactly that point, the point at which Haidt arrives there, it's about 260 or so pages through the book. That's where the Catholic intellectual tradition could take his theory by the hand and lead it forward. And what I mean is, he doesn't have the resources there to name that spiritual problem. He doesn't know what to call it. He doesn't give it a particular name. But it turns out that the Catholic intellectual tradition, the Catholic theological tradition around the virtues and vices, does have a name for that problem and a long tradition of thinking through what it looks like and how to fight it. And that problem is acedia, of course. So I want to show, in this project, what I hope to show is that not only does the problem have a name and a long tradition to go with it, but that we can actually see it in the data once we're clear what we're looking for. So to, I guess, manage expectations, it's not going to be like taking a temperature where there's going to be a device that we put up against your head and then we know if you have acedia and how bad it is. It won't work like that. But I will show you how it works. So I just want to bring down those expectations, make sure they're not too mechanical from the start. So roughly, just a roadmap for where we're going. We'll start with the theoretical approach. Then we'll look at the methodological approach, which is broken into two parts: exploratory factor analysis and confirmatory factor analysis. Finish out with some regression, and then talk through implications. It's a lot to get through in the next bit, but we're going to hang with me. I think we can get there. I didn't count on this being tilted. To start with the theoretical approach, Acedia is within the virtues and vices tradition. It's a capital or one of the deadly sins. It often goes by the name of sloth, which I have also heard pronounced sloth. So apparently no one can decide how any of these words are pronounced. But to attend to a couple of the basics at the theoretical level, what character is a stable disposition, and virtues are stable dispositions toward particular kinds of good actions. So this means virtues and character have interesting features about them, among which is that they both shape our choices and are shaped by our choices. And this sounds circular, it is, but it's a kind of virtuous circle. It is in the case of virtue, and of course a vicious one in the case of vice. I draw for the theoretical part of this project on sources ranging from the Desert Fathers, there are images of them there, Evagrius and John Cassian. Then, of course, the middle one is St. Thomas Aquinas. That's my favorite image of him. And then the final two, bringing it all the way forward to contemporary authors, Rebecca DeYoung and Brandon Dahm. So to start with a new old thought about acedia. So you might be sitting there thinking, what's sloth got to do with any of this psychological stuff? I mean, look, Americans are a lot of things, and not all of them are good, but we're not lazy people. You go to Europe, one of the first things they'll tell you is how overworked Americans are, right? We are not lazy. So how can we be talking, what use is it to talk about sloth? Well, as I started reading through the ancient sources, I thought I knew what sloth was, and I thought it was laziness, indolence, couch potato, right? But it turns out that that is a shorthand of a shorthand of a shorthand, a sort of theological game of telephone. I've reached the age where my references, I have to look to see if they actually land. I think there are enough people who probably played that game in elementary school that you know what I mean. But the source material itself is actually quite a bit more expansive and insightful about what's going on when someone is suffering acedia than merely sort of indolence. To trace it all the way back, its etymology is from a Greek word that means lack of care. And in its original use, it was used to mean a failure to bury the dead. So right from the beginning, it's attached to duties, in this case, the duty to bury the dead. And of course, since time immemorial, the duty to bury the dead has been tied up with religion. And so from the very beginning, this word, even in its ancient Greek form, was tinged with both religious significance and an attachment to the performance or failure to do so of duties. And those two features, of course, are pulled all the way through to today, which is kind of remarkable. It's surprising how consistent it's been over time. Moving from there to Evagrius, he was a desert father, and he has the insight that the manifestations of acedia are from a lack of due care, so this is an advancement, right, a development, lack of due care for one's spiritual life. And he lists 5 manifestations, which are instability, exaggerated concern for the body, aversion to one's proper work, neglect of duties, and generalized discouragement. Along comes Cassian, who cleverly doesn't reference Evagrius a lot, but all the scholars seem to say he was pretty seriously influenced by him. And he adds offspring to these, recognizing that he agrees with those 5, but then there are additional things that come sort of in the wake of those 5. Peevishness, which is a fun word, restlessness, garrulousness, gossipiness, and then laziness. And that's the one that everyone latched onto, right? So it's just one of the outworkings of the initial 5 that people latched onto as the one that defined it. But the concept itself is actually much bigger in the tradition. When we move forward to Aquinas, he gives, I know you'll be shocked to learn that Thomas Aquinas provides the most intricate and organized definition and taxonomy of acedia. Fundamentally for Aquinas, it's a rejection of friendship with God that then deprives us of the deepest motive force toward the good. So he calls it sadness about the good in one place and rejection of charity in another. So this is rejection of the love, refusal to love God and to respond to him. Why does he cash it out this way? It's because that friendship with God, like any friendship, makes demands of us. It places duties upon us. And all of us, as all mature and deep loves do. And he also says there is a great joy that comes only through those relationships. Now, I see evidence of parenthood in the room, and so parents, I think it will probably resonate with them. One part that resonated with me in this thinking is that it is true that I would not on spec choose to have my sleep interrupted 2 or 3 or even 4 times in a night. And yet there is a kind of joy that you don't get anywhere else or any other way from being there in the still small hours of the night feeding your child, taking care of your sick child. There's a kind of joy in that relationship, even if the experience itself is not what you would call a good time, right? So he's on to something here. There's been a contemporary rediscovery. For a long time, it seemed like acedia receded as just sloth and laziness. There has been a kind of rediscovery in recent decades, and Rebecca DeYoung is a key scholar with that. Jean-Charles Nault, whose book I held up, is also part of that rediscovery. Brandon Dahm, who's a professor of philosophy over at Franciscan University, has written on it as well. And I think Dom's development is really interesting. He cashes out kind of the emotional side of the phenomenon. I'm really trying to get us all around this because it's tough to get a handle on, so I'm giving you a little bit from each of the sources that I think when all put together gives us a pretty firm grip on what we're dealing with. The vice of acedia generates the emotion of boredom. We want to be engaged, but are presented with things that feel unengaging, and we get sad about that. And so we avoid those things that no longer engage us, and then we look for new things to engage us. And that tracks very closely with Aquinas' taxonomy, which is intricate, and I can go over it if you want or show it to you. But I think a synopsis here is something like, for acedia over the course of the development of thinking on this vice, is that we fail to do our duties or hard things, and instead of redoubling our effort, we adjust our feelings or rationalize, tripping off this boredom, this restless boredom, which reinforces the shirking of duties further and further. So both DeYoung and Dahm emphasize that acedia spills over it crosses lots of boundaries and touches on lots of other virtues and vices. DeYoung's denotation is one of the most concise, and so I like it a lot, and that is that acedia is fundamentally resistance to the demands of love. Resistance to the demands of love, a shirking of the duties that attend on life's most meaningful relationships. So, to wrap that up, there are some salient features in all of this theorizing for social science measurement. So just to recap some of that, we can account for acedia and make use of these insights, or at least that's what I'm going to try to do. And these 4 points become pretty important. One, that it's a spiritual vice of shirking of duties, the attendant loss of relationship qualities and rise of negative outcomes, and particularly the experience of restless boredom. It won't be measurable in itself, but as you've noticed in all of the descriptions that I gave, all the theoretical descriptions, it's measurable in its outward manifestations. And that's why I gave you the image of that 2023 report on the epidemic of loneliness and isolation that I mentioned. So it can be helpful empirically for understanding what unifies otherwise disparate negative outcomes related to a number of measures regarding human flourishing. And then, of course, finally, it is a spiritual vice, which means it will be in need of spiritual correction, which I'm not attempting yet, but maybe we can talk about what that would look like. So that is the theoretical approach. I realize that was like a 60-mile-an-hour tour of that, and we're going to keep speeding, but I do want to talk a bit about the methodological approach. So in the move from theology to data, so here's how we went about the data side of this project. We are using new data from the Global Flourishing study, which just came out, the first 2 waves of the data. This is a global longitudinal study of flourishing led by primarily a Catholic scholar at Harvard and a Protestant scholar at Baylor. They have serious grounding. Tyler Vanderweel at Harvard, if anybody knows him, and Byron Johnson at Baylor. And they use both medieval and contemporary sources, and we do as well, to develop a measure of acedia and to investigate its relationship to well-being, to understand its role in our personal lives, our social world, and even eventually our politics. So the methodological approach occurs in 2 forms, 2 stages. One is scale development and validation using exploratory factor analysis. And then second, we test that. So the sample size for the US of the data set that we're using is massive. So the Global Flourishing study itself was done over 5 years, over 200,000 participants, which if anybody's ever done survey work, that's just massive. It costs tens of millions, I think, of dollars to do it. In over 20 countries, it's the work of 40+ researchers, and if you sign up for it and have a good reason, they'll just give you access to the data. So I didn't have to pay for any of that. They let you use it. So we use Wave 1 and Wave 2 data to measure acedia, to examine how it affects well-being for U.S. respondents. So I focus just on the United States. And that gets it down to about 38,000 respondents. But 38,000 is still a pretty massive number, and so that enabled us to split that in half randomly, of course, split that in half, and try out, see if we can figure out a model from one half, that's the exploratory factor analysis, and then test it to see if we're right or if we designed junk using the second half of the data. Okay. So this is what exploratory factor analysis looks like. You have these survey items which are actually measurable. You have these dimensions of acedia that are not measurable but are composed of those. The idea is that some survey items are related to others and may be strongly correlated or even caused by the same thing. So here you have like this massive list, and this is just some of the questions. And what we did was, I'm going to speed up a little. What we did was go through and use social science techniques. Again, I can describe what some of these are. This one's called exploratory factor analysis, to see how they cluster. The graph there is a scree plot. What you're looking for is when it flatlines, then all those potential factors. So it arranged these, the data machine will arrange these in ways that could be factors and then see which ones are salient for explaining variance. And you can see that the first 2 do a lot of work, the next 2 do a little, and then it gets pretty flat after that. So those are those 4 factors in that order. So religiosity, relationships, internal discord, and community engagement. So those are the 4 factors that reveal sort of and measure acedia. Then we did some confirmatory. There are 4 tests that we list there in that middle, 4 kinds of tests that we did, and it indicated a good fit on all of those. So so that did confirm that our factor works. So the quality of your faith life, the quality of your other meaningful relationships, Your internal harmony, internal discord or lack thereof, and then community engagement are very predictive of, actually well-being. So this I'm going to kind of buzz by, but this is a kind of spatial arrangement of them that indicates how closely linked they are, where they range from 1 to -1 or thereabouts. Positive values indicate a positive association, and negative values a negative association. Loadings of 0.5 are generally considered acceptable or strong, and so that's what you have there. Here's another quick check. Just, are all of these stacked on top of one another? Are they all telling us the same thing? And here you can see that they're not interchangeable. The closest we get to that is that green one in the middle, but 0.82 is still enough different that it's useful to distinguish it. But the others are pretty low. There's pretty low overlap in all of those. So the final test we did, because I know we're low on time, final test we did is regression analysis, which will start to tell us, so here we have a normal curve, so it's a nice normal distribution of people's self-reported happiness. And here we come to the punchline. At least here, every standard, so what this shows you in that graph on the right is every standard deviation increase in acedia lowers your happiness by a full point on the 10-point scale. And compared to those other things, that effect size is just massive. In fact, I have to confess, it's actually a little, it's sort of a little scary big. It makes me wonder, did we do something wrong? We need to keep looking here, because I was expecting a big effect, but I wasn't expecting one that big. That is profoundly big. But on the other hand, maybe that's just, help me, Lord, in my unbelief. Maybe I should believe what our faith teaches us, which is if your relationship with God is not in good order, much of the rest of your life is probably not going to be in good order. So there are some further implications here. We see in the happiness and flourishing data what we would expect to see if acedia were a significant problem in American society, even controlling for a host of other possibilities, which is what the regression analysis does. It controls for wealth, it controls for mental health, it controls for physical health, it controls for a lot of the other factors that might influence happiness, and still acedia has a big impact. The factors we selected statistically work and are consistent with the deeper sources of theological insight into acedia, both classical sources and more contemporary authors. Religion doesn't work. One of the implications here is religion doesn't work just like any other choice or any other relationship. Its effect is by far the largest. It has an architectonic role with regard to other relationships, and we can see that in the data. Another implication is one strand of modern political and social thought has been an effort to push religion into the private sphere and regard it as just another preference, just another lifestyle choice. Our data suggests that's not a tenable way to think. And then finally, what's driving acedia? That's a bigger question, but one hypothesis is our smartphones are little acedia machines. This project helps us understand why that might be the case and gives evidence for how the phenomenon works. Anything that pulls people away from relationships and or into shallow busyness is a serious risk as an occasion of acedia. Thank you.
Next, we have Margaret Berry.
All right, well, first of all, thank you all so much for being here. Today, I'm presenting on a section of my dissertation on a British ski pioneer named Sir Arnold Lunn. And I think that the title of my presentation, Carving a Path to Rome, is pretty reflective of this talk's subject, which is the centrality of skiing and the Swiss Alps to Lunn's conversion to Catholicism. I want to start, though, by trying to take you all back to Switzerland in the middle of the First World War, and specifically to April 18th, 1916, to the village of Montana, which is about 3,000 feet above the Rhone Valley and was cloaked in about a yard of fresh snow after the past week's storms. It was Lund's 28th birthday, and I think as these pictures show, compared to most British men his age, he had very little to be complaining about. Unable to enlist because of a climbing accident, he was stationed for the last 3 years of the war in his favorite place in the world, Switzerland. Better yet for him, when he wasn't bookkeeping for his father's resort hotels, which had been converted to internment camps for prisoners of war, he was skiing. I don't know how to adjust that. On this particular birthday, though, Lund grieved. He had rejected his Christian faith within the past decade and now struggled with some of his deepest existential anxieties. And he wrote about these fears in his diary that night. I can never enjoy anything wholeheartedly without this most accursed sense of the transience of all joy. This has remained my one solid desire, a desire to know that the universe has meaning, to know that all that I love here will not altogether die. In short, Lund felt that his life was meaningless without immortality, but he also struggled to accept the presence of either one or several gods that offered him any guarantee of it. Lund longed for the promises that the Christian God offered in particular, but he wanted absolutely nothing to do with the God that he thought him to be, a, quote, omnipotent God who invents evil to vary the monotony of good, and this is my favorite part, left far too little scope in the universe for the activities of Arnold Lund. Maybe, Lund thought, he could profess his faith in the God of William James, a God that needed him. That is, if he could find a way to believe. So, within the next week, Lund went on 4 ski tours, one shown here, although that's not Lund, that's a modern picture. I hope you can tell. 6 years later, he set the first slalom ski course behind another of his father's resort hotels. And 17 years later, he received the Holy Eucharist for the first time, thereby entering into the mystical body of Jesus Christ. So given the fact that Lund was one of the 20th century's most prolific Catholic writers and apologists and influential of skiers, this begs questions, particularly relevant for religious and environmental historians. Namely, what changed Lund's mind about Christianity and specifically Catholicism? And what role did the mountains play in leading him to and also keeping him in Rome, which I think is just as important. So Lund, being Lund, was really the first to try to answer these questions. In fact, he went to lengths to do just that, to explain himself to a critical audience of English Protestants and to deliver the last word on his conversion. In Now I See, Lund celebrated the mountains for helping him accept the real presence of the supernatural, but he insisted that his path to Rome was one driven by reason and reason alone. He had not been lured into the church as he accused Chesterton and other British converts in 1924. He had chosen it. And as you can see here, Catholic news sources only reinforce this narrative of Lund's purely intellectual conversion. My research, as I feel like historians tend to do, is revealing a more complicated story. I argue that Lund's religious transformation was driven as much by affective relationships to places and to people, as it was by arguments about Catholic first principles, the metaphysics of transubstantiation, or papal infallibility. Moreover, I argue that Lund's experiences on snow, rock, and ice played a crucial role in helping him navigate the crux of his faith. His fear that the Catholic God and the Catholic Church left too little room for his own creative power. So I am definitely not the first to write on the history of recreation in the Alps, and as I'm sure all of you in this room know, I'm also not the first to write on modern Catholicism or the history of British Catholic converts. These are just a few of the following sources that I draw on. My intention with this research, and focusing on Lund specifically though, is to bridge these fields. First, to take the Alps seriously as not just these central geographic features of Europe, but also as powerful, potent sites of intellectual and spiritual conversion. And second, to take recreationists seriously, not just as these godless consumers of place, as most outdoor recreation historians tend to assume they are, but also as converts who have evolving and deeply intimate relationships to the land. Now, on the one hand, the relationship between Catholicism and mountains is literally the last thing from surprising. You can think of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, Moses receiving the 10 Commandments on Mount Sinai, or the sheer fact that the mountains are referenced 570 times in the Bible. God makes it pretty clear that the mountains are important spiritual sites. What's less obvious, though, and this is the part on the right hand of the PowerPoint, is the ways that mountain activities came to function as pathways for returning to and also reimagining Catholic tradition in the 20th century. And we can see this acutely through Arnold Lunn. Calling on the mountains to promote lay Catholic militancy and quite literally setting new slalom courses on their slopes, Lunn effectively communicated that modern Catholics need not choose between being progressive or conservative, obedient or orthodox or original, obedient to God or liberated as individuals. In the Alps, one could experience the, quote, revolutionary element inherent in Christianity while remaining a political conservative. One could reject the dictatorship of the body while submitting to the authority of the church. So to illustrate these points, I've broken my research into 3 sections, and for the rest of the presentation, we'll briefly go into each. So first, section 1. Here, I place Lunn's pre-1914 writings in the context of British mountaineering culture, and what I accept as the crisis of faith among British intellectuals. I argue that Lunn's social anxieties drove him to approach the Alps as most Victorian and Edwardian mountaineers did, as terrain for self-assertion and escaping the bounds of religious traditions altogether. Now, for context, Lunn really grew up walking in 2 worlds. The first, London, which in the late 19th century was rife with fears about over-civilization, moral depravity, and public health. And second, Switzerland, which at this point was pretty well established as a British vacation land and healthful utopia for the elite. And Arnold very much preferred the latter, as all with the choice pretty much did. Thanks to his father's travel agency, Arnold grew up surrounded by British royalty and aristocrats, and most importantly for this story, British mountaineers. I pay particular attention to the influence of Reverend-turned-agnostic Leslie Stephen on Lunn's early approach to the Alps. And this is because Lunn very much modeled his climbing off of Stephen's. He wrote of his ascents in heroic terms of discovery, of masculine prowess, and of the progressive telos of civilization. And like Stephen, even though he rejected all Christian institutions, he projected their reform-oriented spirit onto the Alps, approaching defeating big peaks, as he liked to call it, as a path to self-improvement. And you can see his extensive climbing resume that he regularly boasted about here. Importantly, anti-Catholicism and really all religious orthodoxy was entrenched in this culture of British mountaineering. In his popular work, The Playground of Europe, Stephen argued that British mountaineers represented the triumph of Enlightenment rationality over a Catholic Dark Age. And this language was pretty typical among London Alpine Club members. In The Roman Mischief Maker, another member, Hugh Stutfield, described Catholicism as the antithesis of modern mountaineering. Where alpinists pushed forward the frontier of civilization, Catholics waged war to the knife against knowledge and progress. And Lunn really followed suit here. As a teenager and well into his 20s and 30s, he measured the freedom of the hills relative to the tyranny of the church. The Swiss Alps were to him fields for the nonconformist, who rejected any inherited tradition of thought. So the second section of my research really focuses on how Lunn's ski experiences during the Great War framed what he desired from a religion, from an Orthodox religion specifically. As I mentioned before, Lund had a pretty cushy situation during the war, but he struggled emotionally during this time for pretty obvious reasons, like the death of many of his loved ones, and for less obvious ones, like his fears about the impermanence of the mountains and his experiences in them. Lund clung to skiing to cope with these feelings. Carving tracks through fresh snow simultaneously gave him an acute sense of control over the outcomes of his life and of mindless immersion in space and time. In other words, the power that he felt from skiing wasn't simply of the domineering sort. It was also the power of submitting himself to the mountain and experiencing intoxicating joy that had no real relation to time. After his ski descent of the Gallenstocks Oberarm Glacier in 1917, for example, Lund tried to translate this feeling of undivided presence in place. "It came to you in a flood of swift feeling," he wrote, "a great harmony of emotion in which one could not discriminate the separate notes." These temporary experiences of ecstasy heightened Lund's desire for a system of belief that gave enduring, immaterial meaning to them. So too did the fact that his agnosticism left very little room to condemn the atrocities of the Great War as objectively evil and morally bankrupt. In other words, it was both personal experiences of anxiety and of joy that forced Lund to confront the implications of naturalistic philosophy, namely a universe without significance, a creed without a code, and a life without hope, which he writes about in this book, The Flight from Reason. In short, he found that it didn't work. This realization motivated Lund to place his faith in a less material presence and an even more conservative body than the mountains. Now, I hope it goes without saying here that there were many non-Alpine factors that drove Lund to accept Catholicism, including his devout Anglican wife, Mabel, and his deep dive into Catholic theology. Also, to say that Lund didn't accept Catholicism overnight is a pretty gross understatement. In the 1920s, he was one of England's most stalwart anti-Catholics, even going so far as to call Catholicism a pathology. But the more Lund sparred with Catholic intellectuals, such as Ronald Knox, the more he found men that he wanted to emulate. Men who were restless, argumentative, and occasionally pretty cutting in their remarks. Lund came to see in them what he thought he'd seen in Leslie Stephen, a countercultural icon, a black sheep in an otherwise uniform herd. Moreover, in large part because of these human relationships, Arnold came to see in Catholicism what he had in the Swiss Alps, a certain otherness from modern life, not only a primordial bastion of the old, but also a protectorate of progressive individuality. But it was first in the Swiss Alps and then in Catholic theology that he found this site of contrast from what he perceived as the flattening forces of global capitalism, industrialization, and liberalism itself. The church's official teachings corresponded with what Lund had already experienced firsthand skiing, that human beings were composites of body and soul, matter, and spirit. And perhaps most importantly, that they had the freedom to choose a life with God and needed to actively struggle for their salvation. So the last section of my research focuses on the period between 1924 and 1936, when Lund successfully established downhill skiing as an Olympic sport. It tracks how Lund leveraged his mountain experiences to counter claims that Rome was for weaklings and Protestantism the religion of men. For example, while serving as a visiting professor of apologetics here at Notre Dame in 1937 and occasionally throughout the rest of the late 1930s, Arnold used an analogy from mountaineering to advocate for Catholic activism against Nazism and communism. Just as the alpinists had to avoid following their leader unthinkingly, lay Catholics needed to judge issues for themselves. Lund's ski career also helped him to show that far from enslaving him, his Catholic faith empowered him to be a modern pioneer. And in certain respects, Lund undeniably succeeded. He converted to Catholicism in 1933 Around the same time, he carved his genre of downhill-only skiing into the international landscape. And you can see just some of these firsts here. Lastly, the Swiss Alps helped Lund work out his lifelong desire to encounter heaven on earth. Indeed, the Oberland Alps were not only crucial actors in Lund's path to Rome, but also reinforced the sacramental worldview that he discovered within it. 2 years before his death, he even admitted as much. The Alps, Lund proclaimed, are still the cathedral in which I find it easiest to worship. Now, it's crucial to note here that Lund was far from the only 20th century Catholic to have a spiritual relationship to the mountains. Our panel's theme is a testament to that. As most of you know, JP2, as well as Pope Pius XI, now Saint Pier Giorgio Frassati, and several other prominent Catholics were avid mountaineers. What you might not know is that they, like Lund, regularly invoked mountains and mountaineering as apologetic tools, both to counter the materialistic tendencies of their age and to call for the spiritual uplift of the human person. And to illustrate this, I thought I'd end with another very brief story, this time of JP2. On September 7th, 1986, JP2 visited Italy's Valdosta region to commemorate the 200th anniversary of the first ascent of Mont Blanc. Speaking from a mountain perch, thousands of feet above the valley floor, he praised mountaineering, 1, for its formation of the human person, and 2, for its ability to inspire the faith of a modern man faced with Soviet communism and enslaved by a materialistic vision of life. Like Lund, the actual ski pope called on the Alps to essentially flip the script on those who characterized Catholics as slaves to Rome. By celebrating mountaineering as a form of spiritual resistance to communism and other heresies of the modern age, JP2 affirmed the message that Lund had spent so much of his life trying to prove, that alpinism had the potential to be more than a sport. If ordered correctly, it could be a powerful ritual practice, in short, a part of Catholic living tradition. So Lund's story, and here JP2's as well, illuminates the ways that Catholic faith, like all faith, I think, is often born of, challenged, and reinforced in environments far beyond the borders of religious institutions, and through activities and ritual practices far beyond the liturgy of the Mass. Thank you. I think I got all of them.
And finally, we have Margaret Schulitter. Okay, great.
You said I can start? Great, okay. I have no fun slides for you. I apologize. The title of my talk is Uncovering the Cross in an Easy World, Distance Running as a Modern Education in Traditional Practices of Discipleship. Athletics is one of the characteristic phenomena of the modern era, almost a sign of the times, capable of interpreting new needs and new expectations. In the 25 years since this proclamation by John Paul II, an interesting pattern seems to be emerging in developing countries. As everyday life becomes increasingly luxurious and sedentary, there's also an increase in the number of people who are regularly participating in endurance-related athletics. This dual occurrence, the listless ease of the world, and a simultaneous interest in endurance sports, presents to the church a new context, a new opportunity within which to form disciples. The church has always maintained that holiness is attainable in every age. Today, I want to argue that in this age, distance running offers a new way of learning ancient practices of Christian discipleship, and that distance running, by its very nature, is particularly suited to this education. And if this is true, then distance running also possesses an ability to push against some of the most common manifestations of sin present in our society. This fact, coupled with its rising prevalence in the modern day, makes distance running an attractive avenue for the church to consider. In the first part of this paper, I want to show that perseverance, or endurance, or steadfastness, really any word that conveys a sense of ongoing and steady effort, is the characteristic of the spiritual life. By this, I do not mean to suggest that perseverance is the primary virtue to which Christians are striving, for certainly love has won that place. But rather, I contend that perseverance is the common trait that all serious disciples share, regardless of their particular virtues and vices. There does not exist a spiritual treatise, old or new, that does not advise continual and repeated efforts to pray. Teresa of Avila contends prayer, in my opinion, is nothing else but a close sharing between friends. It means taking time very frequently to be alone with God. This statement elucidates Paul's exhortation to the Thessalonians to pray without ceasing. And Jesus himself likens human prayer to a person that is incessantly knocking on his neighbor's door. If for no other reason, the neighbor, in this case God, will rise and give whatever is needed simply because of his impudence. In short, one must keep trying, keep investing one's energy, and even if this is painful or the effect seems uncertain, one must trust that God repays faithfulness with faithfulness. The psalmist affirms that the person who meditates day and night on God's law will yield fruit in due season and prosper in all that he does. Perseverance, therefore, is inseparable from faithfulness. The faithful person keeps trying because she knows that the exuberance of the finish line will actually appear. Paul says as much to the Romans. We, Christians, groan inwardly as we wait eagerly for adoptions as son, the redemption of our bodies, for in this hope we were saved. We groan because salvation, the redemption of our bodies, has not yet happened, and so we must remain faithful in this life, during challenges, and in the face of unactualized hope. When Jesus instructs his apostles in their first evangelical mission, he warns them of the perils they will face for following his commands. And he promises, "You will be hated by all for my name's sake, but he who perseveres to the end will be saved." Perseverance seems to be a sort of prerequisite to life with God, now and for eternity, because God and God's self is endlessly enduring. And the church knows this. That's why there are unmovable prescriptions around weekly Mass participation and regular intervals with which a Christian must receive reconciliation. The Eucharist, the source and summit of Christian faith, is received in the form of food, bread, because enacting our faith requires constant sustenance. And even the Liturgy of the Hours, which is prayed by at least all clergy and religious 5 times every day, is predicated on the necessity of just endless repetition. While the tradition has much to say about perseverance, for the sake of time, I can't engage in an exhaustive historical survey, but I'll instead treat 2 theologians on the subject, Augustine of Hippo and Thomas Aquinas. Augustine writes a treatise explicitly on the matter, and Thomas picks it up roughly 800 years later to clarify some aspects in light of developments in the church. Together, I believe that these 2 offer a nearly exhaustive and foundational account of the importance of perseverance for discipleship. Augustine proposed that perseverance is the supreme grace. He identifies it as, quote, "that by which a man perseveres in Christ to the end." He does use the word in his own definition. Persevering in Christ means enduring in faith, and he distinguishes between the beginnings of faith, which is one sort of grace, and the grace of perseverance, which keeps Christians steadfast throughout their earthly lives and brings them safely into the next. Thus, faithfulness necessitates perseverance. Augustine argues that perseverance cannot be lost because perseverance to the end means that one must actually make it to the end. If one fails to do so, he never had perseverance in the first place. In Augustine's paradigm, perseverance is more crucial than faith, strictly speaking, because if not to the end, then faithfulness profits nothing. To be a disciple, to live one's life with Christ, a person must possess the characteristic, the grace, of perseverance. He even says that the Lord's Prayer is specifically a prayer for perseverance. Notably, he argues that perseverance is not merely one of the other virtues, but a unique and perpetual gift from God, essential for the life of discipleship. Thomas Aquinas offers a complementary account of perseverance. In a basic sense, he recognizes perseverance as a virtue because virtues are, quoting Aristotle, about the difficult and the good. But he also acknowledges that it is somewhat distinct from regular virtues. Directly taking up Augustine's account of perseverance, Thomas explains, Augustine speaks of perseverance as denoting not a virtuous habit, but a virtuous act sustained until the end. In other words, perseverance is a consistent characteristic that extends for one's entire life. Thomas agrees that perseverance ought to be understood as a special virtue. He explains that it's a special virtue because every other virtue needs the assistance of perseverance to continue throughout one's life. This is true, he says, even for the three theological virtues: faith, hope, and love. Almost 2,000 years later, John Paul II gathered these insights and explicitly stated the formative potential of athletics for teaching the perseverance of faith. He proclaimed, "It is persevering effort that is needed to succeed in life. Anyone who plays sports knows this very well." He goes on to acknowledge that life is filled with setbacks, pain, disappointment, and our life with Christ is no different. In the face of this, there is the option to quit or persevere. Perseverance carries people through life, through human and spiritual trials, and keeps them faithful to the real telos, the end goal, salvation in Jesus Christ. For the second part of this paper, I intend to show how distance running is capable of teaching this sort of perseverance. From the previous section, two tightly related characteristics of perseverance can be deduced. In the first place, perseverance is characterized by consistency, the ability to keep going in the face of apparent setbacks, difficulties, pain. But this is only possible for the person who has been trained and fortified to resist giving in to bodily urges. The ability to regulate passions, such as distraction, discomfort, impulsivity, is the second necessary characteristic of perseverance. In this paper, I'll refer to it as constancy. Distance running, literally an endurance sport, naturally forms a person in both consistency and constancy. First, consistency. Whether a person is out of shape or fit, clumsy or coordinated, weak or strong, if that person continues to run, she will improve at it slowly. Still further, if a person runs, she'll derive all the benefits that running has to offer, regardless of how good or bad she is at it. Running every day guarantees progress, and most people actually know that, hence the reason that road races are such a popular target for people attempting to lose weight. Interestingly, few people extend that same mentality to their relationship with God. They're dissuaded at the onset from spiritual engagement because of their perception of the state of their soul, beset with sin or a sense of their own wounds, or discouraged by memories of their last failed attempt. They believe that progress, by which I mean only an ever closer relationship with God, is not possible for someone as out of shape, clumsy, or bad as them. But the distance runner learns that progress is somewhat inevitable no matter one's starting point. It's just that sometimes it's difficult to discern in the moment, when the run is particularly painful or the race is extremely unsuccessful. A distance runner recognizes that mere consistency goes a really long way in terms of promising outcome in some form. Discipleship, it turns out, is the same way. In the rule that Benedict of Nursia wrote to organize his monastery, he emphasizes that the beginnings of perfection in God's sight is merely to seek to do good day by day, hour by hour. At the heart of this instruction is the conviction that a person must always, at least, keep trying, even preceding failure. There's no room for discouragement or pride because God's invitation to intimacy is always open, no matter how far or far behind a person is. What's fascinating about this insight, the inevitability of progress for those who keep trying, is that it innately rejects a Pelagian understanding of human work. Our efforts result in progress, but the pace of that progress, the ultimate and culminating success of that progress, is entirely out of our hands. God promises only that our effort does something, not that our human works dictate the final end. While this could be looked at from a theological analysis of grace and works, the distance runner recognizes this intuitively. If a person stays consistent in training, he will lose weight, gain muscle, and run faster. But that progress is not assured to culminating in winning an Olympic gold medal. Positive movement might be affected by our effort, but the ultimate achievement is somewhat out of our hands. When Paul writes to the Corinthians, he famously remarks, "Do you not know that in a race all runners compete, but only one receives the prize? So run that you may obtain it." Then he goes on to explain that we, the entire Christian community, do an analogous effort in order to win the unperishable crown that is salvation. Notice that when Paul draws from the analogy of racing, he believes that all Christians can run so as to win. Everyone can be a winner, as in attain salvation, so long as he continues racing, so long as he keeps extending the effort needed to win. And distance runners, by the way, know quite well what sort of effort that entails. It's not Pelagian because human beings do not do the winning, we merely keep racing. There's a practice among distance runners called building a base. It refers to the training process of increasing mileage and speed in an incremental and tightly controlled way. Therese of Lisieux, a Carmelite nun and doctor of the church, similarly teaches that one's life with God must be built gradually by doing small acts with great love, as she said. Therese grew in holiness by heeding God's request that she not do anything monumental. She was asked to live an otherwise insignificant life, only trying to perfect her efforts to love in each act like God. Therese shows that discipleship means incremental but consistent improvements in our capacity to love. Just like building a base in distance running allows a person to attain mileage and speeds that seemed impossible at the onset, discipleship is lived out by building gradually. Moving now to the second component, constancy. If a person cannot regulate their passions, then maintaining consistency over days, as in a training plan, and over the course of a run will be impossible. In running, passions refer to any emotion that is counterproductive to the purpose of that run. During a run, emotions are experienced to a heightened degree due to the mental and physical fatigue. This is what makes distance running such a beneficial training ground for the cultivation of perseverance in our spiritual lives. Learning to regulate passions that are nearly debilitating during a difficult run will make a person more ready to do so in situations where those passions are not experienced so acutely. Distance running teaches how to master passions through a number of concrete practices, but for the sake of time, I want to focus only on one, which is pacing. Pacing is the even distribution of energy over the course of a run. There are various strategies for teaching and executing good pacing, but all of these strategies hold three underlying skills in common. 1, a controlled release of effort. 2, an ability to withhold engagement with certain thoughts or bring them to the fore. This might be otherwise understood as detachment from the sudden whim of feelings. And 3, a calm response to unexpected variables. These skills are critical for pacing, and they're also necessary for discipleship. Macrina the Younger is a saintly example of the way that these traits make us better disciples. She's described as having an amazing capacity for apatheia. In its context, the word from which we get the modern pejorative apathy does not indicate a void of passion. Rather, it indicates a strong capacity to order one's passions rightly, so that a person can experience the world as it truly is, rather than existing according to an impassioned contortion of the way things are. For example, when faced with the grief of familial losses, Macrina responded by picking up the duty of educating her siblings in the ways of goodness and truth. She did not overcompensate in her grief by trying to educate the whole world. Neither did she wallow away privately in sadness. With eyes wide open to the loss of her loved ones, she responded faithfully and seriously to the responsibility that was now hers. Because she practiced this sort of faithful detachment from the whim of that sadness, she maintained the strength and inner peace to, over the years of her life, educate more and more people. She transformed their family estate into monastic communities and formed the woman entrusted to her care. She was sought out by lay people undergoing distress, and her instruction was eventually immortalized by her loving brother, St. Gregory of Nyssa, in a hagiography. Looking at Macrina, we can see that spiritual apatheia is achieved by the mastery of skills similar to those which are needed for pacing: self-control, detachment, and calmness. To summarize, endurance is a critical underlying component of the Christian life of faith, and theologians throughout the centuries have understood it as such. Distance running offers a new way for members of the church today to learn skills and practices for endurance which are otherwise seldom practiced in modern society. To this end, distance running is also a tool for evangelization. As runners come to appreciate the beauty of living a life that is suitable to the demands of Christian discipleship, then at least one hurdle has been removed from hearing the enduring call of God's love. Thank you.
Thank you to all three of our panelists. You've all run the race well. We have some time now for questions. So please, any questions? Yes.
The skier out, Arnold Lund, if you were, I never knew anything about him. If you were to if you loved mountaineering and skiing and want to read one book, what would you recommend?
Oh my gosh, Mountains of Memory.
Mountains of Memory.
Mountains of Memory, I think, would be my favorite.
That's fine.
He wrote over 60 books, just to give you a sense for how prolific. And most were on Catholicism after his conversion. But Mountains of Memory, Now I See, which is his conversion, well, he wrote several conversion stories. Now I See is the most famous one. I would say it's pretty good, but I think Mountains of Memory is better.
Yeah, and also you guys can grab microphones when you. No, it's okay. I should mention that. Yes.
Hi, Jamie Myers, coming from Gandon University, but also alum of the MTS. So anyway, appreciated your talk very much as a very slow distance runner. Do you see parallels? I'm thinking about, running, especially in spiritual life, gives thought to competition. And especially in the aftermath of Vatican II, we see a real kind of breaking down of a competitive spirituality in the way that it would maybe once had a stronghold, right? It's not just holiness, there's a universal call to holiness, not just those who have an explicitly religious vocation. Do you see parallels there to the trends of the last couple of decades where marathon running now seems to be for everyone, right? Like it's no longer just the folks who in high school could run a 15-minute 5K, but we have 6-hour marathon finishers. Are there parallels there, do you think?
Yeah. Let's see. Can you hear? Is this on?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yes. It's interesting. There have been a lot of studies actually that have shown that there's a insane increase in the amount of participants in races, including marathons and even ultra marathons. And what's interesting though is that the average overall time for finishing is getting slower. Which people who are studying this are saying it's because more people are doing it, so you don't have to be as good. And so the actual pace of people running is slower, which is just interesting. We have the fastest times ever, but on the whole, slower times than ever before. In terms of the competitiveness, I think that is a really something that has to be tagged into for this sort of project, because I think when we, in imagination, think of the competitive athlete, we see someone who's arrogant and disdainful and annoying, quite frankly. And so that's not really compatible with a Christian vision. And so that's why I think Paul's insight on running so as to win, this insight that learning how to compete, learning how to fight, as though you're fighting to win is a really important thing to learn. And learning it in an athletic context teaches us how to do it when the opponent is no longer a peer who you probably have a lot in common with, but something much more sinister.
Kevin, just sort of on the acedia problem, the modern acedia problem. I'm curious, it seems like there's maybe two ways you can sort of veer on framing it, and one is more normative and one is descriptive. So the normative one is sort of the duty, you're neglecting this duty that you have towards others. And so that's the vice, and that's why we're sort of miserable. And then the more descriptive one is kind of it's good to participate in these sorts of giving your time to others, participating in these goods and things. And that's a good thing to do. And that seems like a more psychological kind of thing. It's similar to exercise, we don't make a moral judgment when somebody doesn't exercise generally. You could just say it's just healthy to do it, right? Those are different ways of kind of framing it, and it seems like you sort of chose the more spiritual / normative element where we're neglecting a duty, there's a moral balance to this. But it seems like you could also just frame it as a psychological, it's just good to do this, right? So I guess just in how we phrase this to the world, do you think that there are times to choose either one? Do you think one is just kind of generally better? I'm just curious in your thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's a really helpful way of pulling it apart. My sense is I'll probably, and look, you guys, confession, this was the first time anybody outside my research assistant and my wife have seen the data. So this is the first presentation on it, which is one reason why it was way too much and needs to be pared down. But to answer your question, I suspect when I'm finished writing it all up, this is part of a longer book project, This is a chapter in it. That actually I'll start with the descriptive data, right? Hopefully set the hook, right? But I think it inevitably gets into the normative parts, because what separates the relationships that have the biggest impact in the data is the fact that they're the kind of relationships that we wound up getting bound up in and that impose on us, that relationships of love inevitably impose on us, whether it's a spouse or a child or even a profession, right? It doesn't necessarily have to be limited to close family, but there's kind of an order, God at the top, and actually that one makes the biggest impact. But I do think the normative part will eventually be inevitable as part of it. I couldn't ultimately avoid it. Maybe to draw more people into the conversation in certain places, I would not lead with that card. But I think eventually it has to get there, because what makes those relationships so distinctively impactful in the data itself is, I think, at the theory level, that they are those deeper relationships, and what makes them deeper relationships is that we come to have obligations to one another.
Thank you very much. I found that all very interesting. Margaret, I have a question for you, but first I'd like to suggest that, Margaret. Margaret S. I don't know how to pronounce your last name. First, I'd like to suggest that the art and discipline of lifting heavy things has many of the same spiritual good effects, and that should be noted. But I wonder, is it more common in the contemporary world for patterns and practices of exercise to be built into the sort of glory of religious life than it had been in the past, especially when religious life probably involved a lot more kind of manual labor and that sort of thing?
So you're asking if in the modern day we're more likely to associate
Are you seeing, I guess, in your sort of work that contemporary religious institutes are more inclined to have to build in sort of periods of exercise for religious, and is that even part of their sort of spirituality and that sort of thing?
I have not done wide-scale studies on religious communities, though I know of a few that do that, that wouldn't be the data to back it. What I have found, I've worked with college athletes and college and high school athletes, and I would say more what I found, or more what sort of spurred this, is that that a lot of times athletes, and my experience has been with distance running, that's part of the focus there, that's just where my population sizes have been. They intuit a lot of these things, like they'll say to me, I think running helps me pray better, or I think that because I run, I love God more. But then it just kind of tails, they don't have the words or the language around it, because I think it's a relatively new reality. So what I found is more giving this language to athletes and young athletes oftentimes opens up for them something that they didn't quite have the words. Yeah.
As the other Margaret, I can briefly answer from a historical perspective. I mean, yes, you see with industrialization, a complete correlation within the rise of these outdoor movements and within the church too, the YMCA being a perfect example. So this is happening long before, well, at least sort of long before, but in the 19th century, mid-19th century, you see religious organizations absolutely, and the Catholic Alpinist movement, same thing. You see these people in cities who aren't working manually anymore, who have this need to work their bodies and physically struggle in another way. So I think the answer is yes, and that we can look back to the mid-19th century.
This is a question from Margaret, and for Kevin and the other Margaret. I'm sorry, Margaret. Margaret Cleater on the end, and then Margaret Berry, obviously, who could definitely love this. And I was intrigued by how this panel fits together, specifically your focus on perseverance and constancy, as you called it, dovetailed with thinking about acedia. And I was curious what the two of you, and then this is Barry, if you want to jump in too, how does the virtue of courage figure, especially into your schema, Margaret, focus more on perseverance and constancy? How does courage fit with your schema, and how would courage fit with what you're doing as well, Kevin?
Yep, I can take the first. The first is, you're right, they did fit together. I actually made a note that in thinking through the remedies to acedia, I need to add distance running, and now, to JD's point, weightlifting as well. So I need to add those. But yeah, the virtue of courage does enter in, because that's about overcoming the fear of doing something difficult or dangerous, right? And in this case, perseverance is really important. You need courage for perseverance, because oftentimes it is hard. Even the greatest saints go through periods of very dry spiritual life. And so maintaining that perseverance and sort of starving the vice of the food it needs and wants, it requires courage on our part. I mean, ultimately, the most frustrating thing about the life of virtue is that you find there are no shortcuts. You can't get rid of any of them and just say, well, look, it's nice we have this panoply of virtues, but if you really just focus on this one, you'll be fine. You won't, right? You actually need all of them.
Yeah, I think I would only add, so I focused on where Aquinas talks about perseverance as a special virtue, but he also puts perseverance as a regular virtue as a subset of fortitude or courage. And I think that's like, and part of his reasoning is that you need to be like when something scares you or something is a challenge to you, you have to just keep taking steps in order to combat it. Like, you can't take it all on. And then interestingly, for the connection for what I was doing is that then he says the strongest part of the cardinal virtue of fortitude or courage is endurance, which is standing immovably in the face of challenge, like standing immovable. So I just think that's kind of interesting how he plays with like perseverance, courage, and endurance.
I have a lot to say, but I will just briefly note that yes, courage is for anyone who's climbed a mountain, specifically a mountain with lots of steep drops and difficult slope angles. It requires a lot of courage, and there's a question there about what the line is between healthy, virtuous courage and then, non-virtuous courage, where one is risking their life unnecessarily. But I will say that yes, like mountaineering in Lund's imagination and Catholic alpinist imagination was this kind of path to virtue in large part because it taught that virtue of courage. And so if done within one's physical limits and done safely, then it was exactly what the panel did fit together nicely. Yeah, that practice of endurance and, again, a physical act of a spiritual gift and virtue.
With that tying together note, I think that's a good place to end. Thank you so much for being here, and please thank our panelists.